The Bantam Star Trek novels. This is episode 73.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casco, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
It's hard to imagine today, but there was a time when book publishers were not sure that Star Trek fiction would sell. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casto. But Bantam Books saw the growing Trek phenomenon in the 1970s and decided to take a chance. And I think their gamble paid off.
Boy, it sure did. And we're going to talk about the Bantam line of Trek novels. But first, we should tell listeners how to find us.
Sure. Just visit our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70s Trek. You can also find us at 70strek.com. Now, if you like, you can also send us an email to, guess what, 70strek@gmail.com.
And you can also find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. Just search for 70s Trek, and when you do, please leave us a comment or a review because it will help others find the show. Bantam began publishing Star Trek books way back in 1967 with the first James Blish episode adaptation. Of course, the Blish books were a huge success in the 1970s.
After Star Trek the Animated Series left TV, Bantam began publishing the Star Trek Log series by Alan Dean Foster. And these, of course, are based off of that Saturday morning show.
But writing and publishing original stories, original Star Trek fiction, on a regular basis hadn't begun yet. You know, prior to 1976, there had only been one original Star Trek novel, and that was Spock Must Die, with an exclamation mark, by James Blish. Kelly, why don't you tell us a little bit about that book?
Sure. So, of course, James Blish wrote Spock Must Die, and it was published in February 1970. Now, let me just give you a couple little tidbits about the story or the book before we get into the story. And I won't do this for every book, but this book was the first adult novel, original novel. There was a kid's book, Mission to Horatius, in 1968. So, don't know if you knew that, Bob.
I did.
This book, and we'll get into it, of course, but it's kind of a sequel to Errand of Mercy. And the book actually mentions what happened in Errand of Mercy. Now, Blish wanted to do something different with this, as the title suggests, and he decided he wanted to kill off a character. You know, whoever thought that they'd kill off Spock? So he took a chance and wanted to kind of, leave people guessing.
That's pretty gutsy.
Yeah. And, he did want to do a sequel to this book, but he died before he could make that happen. So let me jump into the story here, or the premise of the story. I'm not going to go too deep. The Klingons have declared war. And, of course, based off of Errand of Mercy, the Organians are like forbidding this, right? No, you're not going to go to war. But there's no word from them. And the crew of the Enterprise are supposed to figure out what's going on, but they are way far away from Organia. And they're trying to figure out how to get there to figure out what's going on. So then Scotty had devised a means of using tachyons to try and transport somebody great distance.
He basically souped up the transporter, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so Spock was the obvious choice. So they tried it on him, and instead of sending him to Organia, they created two versions of Spock, which they dubbed Spock 1 and Spock 2.
Well, what else you got to do? I mean, Spock
Right.
left and Spock right, you know?
Yeah, the only problem is they couldn't figure out which was which.
Ah.
And McCoy kind of figures out a way based off of what Spock eats. And it was almost like they ate different foods. It was like the opposite. Well, they arrive at Organia, and they figure out who's the bad Spock, quote unquote. But the bad Spock goes down the planet. Whatever happens, the real Spock beams down and actually kills the fake Spock. And they find that the Organians were imprisoned by the Klingons. The Organians get loose, and they punish the Klingons by preventing them from space travel for 1,000 years.
What the hell happened to that?
It really needs a sequel.
It does need a sequel because I'm pretty sure that didn't happen.
I'm pretty sure.
Right. That's funny. The book obviously sounds a lot like The Enemy Within, when Captain Kirk is split into two and one version is evil and one version is not. But it's interesting that Blish kind of went down that path for this first book, too.
Yeah.
That's neat. Well, you know, it took 6 years before Bantam decided to try exploring fiction, new fiction for Star Trek. During that time, they were still publishing the Blish adaptations, I should say, and began publishing the Alan Dean Foster Log 1 series, as you mentioned. But in 1976, they published Star Trek New Voyages. And what this was a collection of original Star Trek fiction. And it's probably the first time that fan-written fiction was professionally published for any franchise in any genre. This was all fan-written fiction. The editors were Sandra Marshank and Myrna Colbreth, and they wanted to do something special with this book, so they asked Roddenberry to write the foreword, and they asked each of the cast members of Star Trek to write a brief introduction to the stories. How about that?
Yeah.
And, of course, the first one is Leonard Nimoy, and then the last one is William Shatner. And so they end up sort of bookending all of this fan fiction. Unfortunately, Walter Koenig does not appear in the book. He was asked to write an introduction, but the story that he wrote the introduction for got cut because of space. And so there's poor Walter Koenig again being cut out. Come on, guys.
Show him some love.
That's right. Noteworthy here is one of the stories in the book. It was about the actors who play Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. You're going to like this. The actors, Shatner, Nimoy, and Kelly, find themselves in an alternate universe where their fictional counterparts are real. That story is called Visit to a Weird Planet Revisited by Ruth Berman. That's such a unique take. I just thought I had to mention that. That's a neat story idea.
That is.
You know, Paramount execs had to sign off on this. They were very worried and had to be convinced that publishing fan fiction was a good idea. They were extremely hesitant. And in fact, everything had to go through them. They wanted to make sure that this fan fiction was up to professional standards. It adhered to the Star Trek universe as we knew it in 1976. You know, they weren't creating new and strange propulsion or, you know, tachyon transporters or anything like that. And they also wanted to make sure that Paramount was not embarrassed. That was kind of a big one for them.
Yep.
And, of course, they weren't. New Voyages became a mass marketing breakthrough. It helped fuel the ever-increasing Star Trek phenomenon that was really catching hold in 1976. And it showed publishers at Bantam that there was an audience for Star Trek fiction. So what happened after that? Well, we got a bunch new fiction by Bantam Books. Why don't you tell us about the next one?
Alrighty. So the next one is Spock Messiah. The authors, Theodore Cogswell and Charles Spano Jr. It was published in September 1976. And just a couple notes here. This novel was highly criticized. It kind of put women in a bad light.
Oh,
so
really?
So there's a new character here, Ensign Sarah George, and they refer to her as having a pert little bottom.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah, they were a little racist and several times described her as black. And then there were inaccuracies. So Scotty had red hair. I mean, they must have read the comics.
Oh, my goodness. Really?
Yeah. Kind of crazy. So I'll jump into the story here. The Enterprise crew is exploring a planet called Kairos. And as not to violate the Prime Directive, the landing party actually is using implants to imprint on the Kairosians, kind of like doppelgangers.
Wait a minute. What? This is our Enterprise crew.
Yes. So
Are imprinting themselves on the native population kind of thing?
Yeah, kind of like that that one movie that came out recently.
Where the people were blue?
Yes.
And they used, was it like an avatar? They used an avatar to
an
try
avatar, yeah.
Are you serious? They were doing something like that?
Yes, they're doing something like that. So, because this is a more primitive society, they didn't, they were trying not to, upset the apple cart,
That's
so to
interesting.
speak.
Yeah.
But this also allowed the crew to gain access to their doppelgangers' memories and actually their personalities. And it further helped them to study the Kairosian society.
But in a way, it's an invasion, isn't it?
Yeah.
A little bit?
A little bit. Now, there's something that kind of goes wrong. The Spock's linked to this fanatic, and the fanatic's name is Chad Gara, and he kind of goes nuts, and he forms a religion.
Chad Gara.
Yeah.
Che Guevara.
Chad.
Do you think there's a relation there between the two?
Yeah.
Between the real life Shay and the fictional character Chad?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the Enterprise, of course, to add to the drama, there's some kind of radiation thing going on. The Enterprise needs to get the heck out of the system as soon as possible, but they can't find Spock. And Spock's disciples capture the away party while they're searching for him. Now, they do this, their advanced technology to create some magic so that they can get loose. And Ensign Sarah George does a seductive dance for the Messiah.
For Spock?
Yeah. Which ends up flushing out Chag, and they capture him and recover Spock and break the link and everything, and then the Enterprise leaves.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an interesting story.
It is, but it's not rated well. It's actually one of the worst books that was created.
I feel like we just read a Gold Key comic.
Yes, exactly. I told you, I think they read the comic.
They might have. Well, let me tell you about The Price of the Phoenix. And this book was written by the editors of New Voyages, Sandra Marshank and Myrna Colbreth. And it was released in July 1977. Here's kind of the story. Captain Kirk is beamed aboard the Enterprise. Dead. He's dead. He's in a body bag. He's dead. Somehow Spock finds out who killed him. And he confronts this entity. The entity is known as Omni. O-M-N-E. Omni. Now, Omni listens to Spock and decides, okay, I can resurrect your captain. And he does. But when he resurrects Kirk, it's a duplicate of him. And Omni claims that now this duplicate is his property. But Spock can have him for a price. So to save Kirk, Spock might have to sell his soul. The book really is an interesting idea. It is asking the question, what would someone pay if he or she lost a loved one and they could possibly bring them back? What would you do? How far would you go? This book was a pretty big one for Bantam. The publisher published 250,000 copies in the first run, which was a lot for a science fiction book. They sold them all out. And in fact, the book quickly went into a second and third and a fourth printing after that. And Price of the Phoenix hit the bestsellers list, obviously. This is a kind of a funny story related to the book. Prior to it being released, the authors were having lunch with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. And you have to remember when this was. This is prior to July 1977. As we've chronicled in earlier podcasts, Paramount at this time is having a heck of a hard time trying to find a Star Trek story to make a movie out of. So as they're sitting there having lunch, Shatner says, I don't know why Paramount is still looking for a script. Their novel, meaning Marshank and Culbreth, their novel should be the script for the Star Trek movie. That's how much he thought of it.
Wow.
That's interesting, too, because, as we know, Paramount limped on for another couple of months trying to figure out what to do with the franchise. That is the story of The Price of the Phoenix.
All right. Well, let me tell you about Planet of Judgment. The author of Planet of Judgment is Joe Haldeman, and this was published in August 1977. Kind of a funny story, more morbid story here. When James Blish died, Joe contacted Fred Pohl, who was the editor at Bantam Books, editing these Star Trek books. And he said that he apologized for being ghoulish, but said, now that Jim is dead, who's going to be writing the Trek books? Get it? Jim is dead. So Fred said, you.
Oh, because nobody else is called yet.
Right. Joe intended to write more books. He got a decent advance on his book, $7,500 at the time. But his second sci-fi book that he wrote, he got a $100,000 advance and didn't see any reason to continue writing Star Trek books. I wonder why. All right, so here's the story. The crew of the Enterprise detects a rogue planet, and they call it Anomaly. Imagine that. And it's orbited by a miniature black hole. Now, this is really obviously very weird. It goes against all scientific laws and principles. And, they beam down and nothing's working. Nothing technology-wise is working on this planet. And they actually become trapped once they get there. The Enterprise can't send a shuttle down because it'd crash and burn. They can't beam out. So, they're kind of in a pickle now. They should never have beamed down. The crew finds themselves at the center of this galactic conflict. Now, there's this alien race that is threatening to invade the Federation. So somehow they work this magic with the black hole and everything as a prelude to invasion, I guess. So the landing party, who is the usual McCoy, Spock, and Kirk, they participate in a series of trials for this alien race and to determine if they're going to survive or not. And they do, obviously. So that's Planet of Judgment.
That's interesting. Well, the next book in the line was Star Trek The New Voyages 2, released in January 1978. And it is just what it sounds like. It's a second collection of fan fiction. It contained 8 original stories and 2 poems. Marshank and Culbreth edited the book and then also wrote 2 original stories for it, one of which they co-authored with Nichelle Nichols. Kind of a neat little aside there.
Yeah.
And they really tried to use the book to help NASA, who at the time was going through some cutbacks in their budget, and sort of were trying to get fans to rally around and help NASA out. So that was one of the aims of the book as well. That is New Voyages 2.
All right. The next book, Vulcan, with an exclamation point.
Yeah, make sure you include that.
The author, Kathleen Sky. This book was published September 1978. And this story, little note, Kathleen originally sent a script outline for this story to Gene during the 3rd season.
Really?
Yeah. He liked it so much, he said, this could be an episode. We should try and get that in season 4. Dun, dun, dun.
Thanks, Gene.
Yeah, thanks.
You think that probably did it right there?
Yeah. Bantam approached Kathleen, though, as they're looking for authors, and to see if she was interested in writing a Star Trek book. Well, guess what? She had the material already. She just needed to put it in a book form. And that's what she did for this story. And another just quick note, Kathleen's husband, Stephen Golden, also wrote a Star Trek book, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Oh, cool.
The story, just high level here, there's an ion storm, and it causes the boundaries of the neutral zone between the Federation and Romulans to shift. And there's a planet involved, Arachne 4. It's inhabited by these strange ant-like people, or a race.
Ants?
Ants.
Like
yes.
big ants?
Big ants.
Wow.
Need some raid. So the Enterprise is there so that they don't lose this planet to the Romulans, and so they go there to try and protect them. And unfortunately, there's a war going on with these ant-like creatures, and so Spock goes down, and his assignment is to try and get them on the Federation side. And that's the very short story of Vulcan.
Huh. Well, let me tell you about The Starless World by Gordon Eklund. And that was released in November 1978. Here's the story. The Enterprise finds a shuttle from a missing starship. And aboard is a former roommate of Captain Kirk's from the Academy. His name is Clayton. And he thinks he's Jesus Christ.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. Well, they lock him up, obviously, and try to get him some help. And the Enterprise moves on with its mission, and they end up in orbit around a world. Clayton somehow knows where they are, escapes confinement, runs up to the bridge, and he begins praying to his god, Anab. Now, who or what is Anab? A black hole that is threatening to swallow this entire planet. That's who Anab is. And in the story, there are also some Klingons running around that we have to take care of.
Of course.
Of course. That is The Starless World.
All right. Let's move on to Trek to Mad World, written by Stephen Golden, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. It was published January 1979. Now, Stephen actually is a pretty accomplished author. He's a Nebula Award finalist. This book has a foreword by David Gerrold.
Nice.
Yeah. And now, I don't know if this is so nice. This book has been described as Star Trek meets Willy Wonka.
Oh, dear. Really?
Yes. So the story goes something like this. The Enterprise has orders to go to Epsilon Delta 4, where there's 700 colonists dying of radiation poisoning. On the way, they encounter an extremely powerful being called an owl. And this being takes control of the Enterprise, along with a Klingon ship and a Romulan ship. And he does this so that they could help him resolve a private matter. Now, if one of these can help him resolve his issue, whatever it might be, he is offered a reward of great power. Now, Kirk is in a tough spot here. Does he stay and try and keep the balance of power between the Federation, Romulans, and Klingons? Or does he go and save the 700 colonists? You'll have to read to find out.
Oh, I was afraid you were going to say that. Okay. Let me tell you about World Without End by Joe Haldeman. That was released in February 1979. And Mr. Haldeman also wrote, as Kelly mentioned earlier, Planet of Judgment. Here's the story. The Enterprise finds a hollow asteroid, and they discover that there are furry, winged, intelligent creatures living inside. Now, Kirk takes a landing party, and they beam inside, and they meet these intelligent people. But then Kirk and the crew are quickly taken captive because these folks, these people, these furry winged creatures, don't believe that there is any kind of universe outside of the walls of their asteroid. What exists out there? Well, nothing. What are you talking about? In the meantime, Spock, who's aboard the Enterprise, he's discovered the wreck of an ancient, and we mean old, Klingon starship on the surface of the asteroid. And the furry winged creatures are worried about a roving band of murderers inside their world. All interesting stuff that Kirk's got to try and figure out. That is World Without End.
All right, next we have The Fate of the Phoenix, authored by Sandra Marshak and Marina Kolbreth. It was published on July 1979. Of course, this is the sequel to The Price of the Phoenix. And the story goes, Kirk is appointed ambassador to the Voran dynasty. It's a world near the Romulan Empire. And on this isolated planet, the crew of the Enterprise must face, once again, Omni.
Oh, not him again.
Yeah, he's back. Just like a phoenix. Now, do you remember the original Star Trek episode with the female Romulan commander?
The Enterprise incident.
The Enterprise incident. Well, she's back.
Oh, really?
Yes. And she's there, or she's actually suspected of treason, joining forces with the Federation on Omni's world. And there's the disguised James Kirk, or the Kirk double from Price, is with her.
Oh, so from Price of the Phoenix, that Kirk is still alive and kicking.
He's alive and kicking, and there potentially is a romantic connection with the female Romulan commander.
Is Spock a little jealous?
They don't say.
Okay. We'll have to read the book.
So Omni holds Kirk prisoner and releases a deadly ray that injures most of the landing party, including Spock, who Spock is severely injured. Well, Kirk pleads with Omni to resurrect him, and of course he does, and guess what happens?
There's
a duplicate of Spock is created.
And wait, this sounds like Spock Must Die.
Yes.
Sorry, I know.
That's right. And this duplicate, though, is dead set at killing Omni and Spock.
There's a lot of killing here.
There is. It's only by joining forces that there's a chance to destroy the duplicate Spock and guarantee safety for everyone.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a must-read right there. Well, let me tell you about the next book published by Bantam. It is Devil World by Gordon Eklund. And if you remember, he wrote The Starless World as well. And this book was released in November 1979. Well, we're getting late here.
There we are.
Imagine the world Heartland. It is a mysterious place and it's got a secret. Living there is a race of demonic-looking beings. And when I say they're demonic-looking, I mean they've got horns coming out of their head and they've got barbed tails.
Do they have pointy ears?
They could. Let's say that they do.
Okay.
Now, the Federation has run into these folks before, and they've decided to quarantine this world. It's kind of strange. It's very mysterious. It's just not a good place to visit. So there's a quarantine on it. Through the story, Kirk meets a woman. There's always a woman. Kirk meets a woman who believes her father is on Heartland, and she convinces Kirk to take her there. That's going to be a problem right away.
Oh, yeah.
When they arrive, the crew meet a disembodied intelligence, and this thing is more powerful than any force in the galaxy. Can you say Q? Could be Q.
Could be.
Or cousin Q.
Or P.
If they're all known as Q, but there are different Q, how do you differentiate between all of the Q? But pardon me, I digress. So the secret of this world could destroy the Enterprise and drive everyone insane because it's just too much to comprehend. Now, this story, along with the Starless World, are retellings of the classic Joseph Conrad story, Heart of Darkness. So Eklund was really sort of patterning these two tales off of that classic piece of literature. And that is Devil World.
All right. The next book is Perry's Planet. The author, Jack C. Haldeman. It was published on February 1980. So we're getting really late here. The story is about the Enterprise, who is ordered to the planet Perry, which was the destination for a group of colonists some 300 years ago. When the Enterprise arrives, they find a peaceful society where there's no one is, violent. There's no conflict, nothing. However, there are a few people that are immunes. They're called immunes, actually, and they are resistant to this peace, whatever it is. It's like a disease. Well, the immunes capture Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Uhura, and Kelly Davis. And Kelly Davis is a doctor who is temporarily assigned to the Enterprise while she's recovering from an explosion in a transporter room. I'm sure there's a lot more behind that. But, on board the Enterprise, Scotty is faced with more trouble from, of course, a Klingon commander named Coral, who has sworn a blood oath to kill Kirk.
Come on. Seriously? Everybody wants to kill him.
I know. Or, other things.
Well, anyway, go ahead.
Anyway, well, that's Perry's Planet.
Cool. Let me tell you about The Galactic Whirlpool by David Gerrold, and that was released in October 1980. Just a side note, there are a few books here published later than 1979. We're aware of that. We're aware of the show's title, 70s Trek. We're going to tell you about them anyway. One of them is The Galactic Whirlpool. I sounded a bit rough there, didn't I? Sorry, I didn't mean to sound so brash. Of course, we know David Gerrold is the writer of the episode The Trouble with Tribbles, and this is the first and only Star Trek novel that he will ever write. Here's the story. The Enterprise is on a mission near the center of the galaxy. We're either at the center of the galaxy or we're heading out of the galaxy. That's where all the crazy stuff happens. Maybe we should just stay away from those two areas.
Maybe.
While they're there, near the center of the galaxy, they discover a massive ship. I mean, this thing's supposed to be huge. It dwarfs the Enterprise. And at first, when they approach it, it seems to be abandoned. But they quickly discover something shocking about this ship. It actually originated from Earth. They don't have all the records about it, but they know the ship is of Earth origin. So Kirk asks Lieutenant Kevin Riley, remember that name?
Yes.
To lead a landing party inside the ship. He does so, and he discovers a group of humans living inside. But these humans attack the landing party. They're extremely hostile. So while Kevin Riley is fighting off these very hostile humans inside this big giant ship, Chekhov discovers that this big giant ship is actually adrift. There's no power, and it's heading toward a black hole. Well, now the Enterprise crew, they've somehow got to negotiate with these very hostile humans if they want to try to save them and the ship. Of course, that's what the rest of the book is about. Now, the story was adapted from the very first outline that David Gerrold sent to Gene Roddenberry way back in 1967, even before he sent The Trouble with Tribbles.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, his original story was intended to be a 2-part episode. So there was a lot of content there. So when it came time for him to turn it into a book, it was pretty easy for him to do. He just really fleshed out some character stuff more. And also of note here is that Gerald references a real star, Wolf 359. And as Trek fans today know, Wolf 359 is where the Federation fought the Borg in the Next Generation episode, The Best of Both Worlds, Part 2. And that is the Galactic Whirlpool.
All right. The last book we have, Death's Angel, was written by Kathleen Sky and published April 1981. And just kind of a little note here, Bantam was so impressed with Kathleen's treatment on Vulcan, with exclamation point, the book we talked about earlier, that they asked her to do another one. And she loved murder mysteries, and she thought it might be fun to do something like that with Star Trek. Now, Paramount just asked that make sure there's lots of aliens and make sure Kirk has a romance. So here we go with Death's Angel. The crew visits a planet, and there's some repercussions for visiting this planet for Kirk, Spock, and some of the other crew. The crew goes in a deep coma, and McCoy has no idea why this happened. Several days later, they wake up and they seem in great health. Well, they're ordered to bring a delegation of ambassadors to a space station and to do some peace treaty with the Romulans. Well, the problems start when there's a murder. And then there's reports of seeing an angel of death. And this kind of, unnerves the ship. So along comes a beautiful SSD, assuming that's a security officer. And this officer arrives at the Enterprise to capture the killer. And, of course, capture Kirk's attention. So there is Death's Angel.
That's neat. Well, those are kind of the Bantam novels in a nutshell, if you will. In 1979, Paramount decided not to renew with Bantam and awarded Pocket Books with its publishing license. And in fact, the novelization for Star Trek The Motion Picture, it was released in 1979 by Pocket Books, even though Bantam would continue to publish under its contract through 1981. So they had 2 publishers going at one point. Bantam's last Star Trek book was published in April 81, and Pocket released their first book just 2 months after that. So it was stop one line, the next line picked up. In all, Bantam only published 12 original novels and 2 anthologies between 1976 and 1981.
Yeah, but the quantity really doesn't matter. Just the fact that they took the chance and started publishing these books is what matters. I mean, original stories, right?
Right.
It was Bantam, the Bantam line, that led to the explosion of content by pocketbooks in the 80s, 90s, and beyond.
Next week, we're staying up late to watch The Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder.
It's the historic Star Trek episode from 1976. See you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.